सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In the last episode of Macrosutra, we talked about how and whether the big corporates in India need to be broken up, and we answered that question quite comprehensively. Now, keeping with the same corporate theme, we're going to be looking at the early bird corporate results for Q4 of the last financial year, that is 22-23, and Q4 being the January to March period. There are a few companies that have already declared their results. These are the early birds. And even though they're few, they do give an indication of how the results are likely to turn out. So that's the question we're going to address in this episode of Macrosutra. What do the early bird results tell us about the health of the corporate sector? I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and we have with us Radhika Pandey, a Senior Fellow at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us.
Sharad.
So now, Radhika, I know that you've looked at this data and you have compiled it. And so, but before we start that, could you tell us what these early birds are, and are they enough of a subset to tell us more about the corporate sector health?
So right now, the early birds, the firm that we are looking at currently, they are about 59 to 60 in number that we are looking at. And we are including only firms that are not in the financial sector and not in the oil sector. So we are, because the question is, what is some of the early indication about the health of the private corporate sector? Mm-hmm. So we want to look at firms in the non-financial and non-oil sector, right, which would include both manufacturing set of firms as well as services firm. Mm-hmm. But we exclude banking and we exclude the oil firms because banking or financial firms have a different set of accounting practice. Right. So there are some analysis done where they are including both non-financial as well as financial firms together. Mm-hmm. But if we want to look at what's happening to the state of the economy, the private corporate sector, it's better to exclude those firms and look at them separately, because the concepts are different. In banks, we are more concerned about loan growth, we are concerned about deposit growth, we are concerned about net interest margin, we are concerned about the asset quality of banks. But here we are referring to firms that we are looking at their sales growth, we are looking at how much they are spending on raw materials, what's happening to their profitability, and so on. Now, that is why the number is 59, because we have excluded the financial firm, even though they have also some of the financial firms, namely some banks, have also declared their results, the fourth quarter financial results, but we are not looking at those. We are looking at a set of non-financial, non-oil firms. Now, overall, the universe is around 3,000 firms, 3,000 plus firms. But we are, because as of now, till yesterday, it's only around these firms that have declared their financial results. Every day, we are seeing more firms are declaring their results. Yes, like today, Hindustan Lever declared their results. But what we do see is that it's giving us a correct, or you can say adequate representation of various sectors.
So it is representative. It
is representative because we are taking some firms, as you can see, we have shown a table where we are seeing how many firms belong to the manufacturing sector, how many firms belong to the non-financial services sector. Right. Within manufacturing also, textile is there. We have information technology within the services. We have chemical firms. So even though the number of firms is lesser, but adequately it's capturing some of the key sectors where there are concerns or where they are impacted by global headwinds. So it does give an early indication of at least the direction in which the profits may be moving or the sales revenue of firms may be moving. Mm-hmm. The magnitude of costs will change, but it's good to have a look at early birds. And again, the definition of early birds would also change. If we do something on, say, May 1st week, our set will be will have more number of firms.
Of course.
So firms keep declaring results, and particularly for the March quarter, up till June, they keep declaring results because they also declare their annual results as well. So that is why it's slightly delayed as compared to the other quarters. But what we do is that we are looking at these 59 firms and giving some indications about their various metrics of financial performance, both at the quarterly level as well as at the annual level.
Now, Radhika, you have analyzed these firms and they are indicative. So then can you tell us what your analysis tells us about the profitability and the revenue positions of these companies?
Yes. So as regards the revenues is concerned, we look at what is termed as the sales revenue, the revenue from sales, which is the most important component of the total income of these companies. And there we see that for the March quarter, it has the sales revenue has declined in growth terms as compared to the December quarter.
So it's not a contraction, but it's lower growth.
Yes, it's lower growth. So as an example, for the quarter ended December, the sales revenue growth was 16% for these 59 firms, and for the latest March quarter, it's around 12%.
Okay.
So there is definitely a deceleration in sales revenue, and that also gets reflected in profits. Now, when we talk about profits, there are two components: the revenues and the costs. So what is happening is that the revenues are not going at a very fast pace. On the other hand, costs have risen, particularly for some kind of firms. The costs have risen. We are seeing that interest expenses of firms have shot up like by an exorbitant 40% in the March quarter. So till now, we were just anticipating that slowly the interest rise that we are seeing on a sustained basis, 250 basis points rate hike has been done by the RBI since May 2022. But now in the firm's financial results, we are seeing the impact. So in other words, the borrowing costs of firms have started to rise. And this is in sharp contrast to what we saw last year around the same time, March 2022, where interest expenses were in contraction mode because by that time interests were low, and in 2021 we saw firms borrowing a lot, both domestically as well as from external commercial borrowing. But this time around, since May 2022, because of sustained interest rate hikes, we are seeing that the interest component of firms has risen, and that is reflected also in the profitability.
Of course.
Because if the costs will rise, your revenue are not going at a very fast pace, but your costs are picking up. Some components of costs are picking up. So that is resulting in shrinking profitability of firms, both in terms of operating profit and net profits. Now, there are some, it's very interesting to see that these 59 firms belong to different sectors and they all have different stories to tell. For example, there are IT firms in this set. There are three key IT firms. The set has Infosys, the set has TCS. So the important information technology firms that have declared their financial results, and they are saying in their investor presentation that they have been impacted because of global headwind, because of the banking crisis that happened in the US and Europe, because banks in other countries are major consumers or buyers of technology. So they are facing headwinds, and therefore the revenues of IT firms have been squeezed. So there are sector-specific stories within each of this set. There are textile firms, and textile firms we have talked about earlier also that the gross value added of manufacturing sector has also been brought to a slide because of the textile sector. So there are sector specific variations both on the negative and on the positive side.
Of course. And so now when you look at the revenue and the profit position, do you see an overall trend for all of these companies, or as you said, is it overwhelmingly different for each sector?
It is different for each sector, and that is why when we look at aggregate numbers, we also need to look at the sectoral trends and look at the sector specific developments that may have shaped their financial performance. Like as of now, this set is influenced by the IT sector, because the key IT sector firms have declared their results and therefore they are in the set. And these firms' revenues have been subdued because of global headwind. On the other hand, it doesn't have very many firms in the FMCG sector.
Right.
And when we will include more firms in the FMCG sector, we will see that this will improve, because some of the what we are seeing is that now rural demand is showing some early signs of pickup. Some of the FMCG firms, the fast-moving consumer good firms, have already indicated that they are seeing an increase in their volume of sales also. So when we will have more of these firms, right now there are only one or two, and they are showing good recovery.
Right.
So in the sample. So while IT and textiles are not performing well, there are some other firms which have in fact recovered. They have done better as compared to the December quarter. So it all depends on what sectors are included in the set, and it's always also better to look at the sectoral trends and what are the developments that may have shaped their performance, and also look at annual numbers.
Right. So now the big thing you say on the cost side is the interest costs.
Yes.
And that of course has risen because of the 250 basis point RBI, the repo rate hike by the RBI since May 2022. But are there other costs? Because the wholesale price index,
Right.
that inflation has been now easing for several months now.
Yes.
Yet the costs for companies don't seem to be going down. So what is happening?
Yes. So there we look at what is termed as the raw material expenses. And there also, if we look at the data, we saw that the raw material expenses reached their highest level in the September 2022 quarter.
Right.
And since then, they have been moderating, but they are still quite elevated. So while you are right that WPI is going down, and in fact, there's a very important series to look at, especially to capture the raw material prices, which is shown in this month's RBI's bulletin, State of the Economy chapter, where they look at industrial input based WPI and farm inputs based WPI.
I see. Yes.
So what they have done is they have constructed a wholesale price index by taking only those items that constitute the inputs for the farm sector, like high speed diesel and so on. So that is in the farm sector. In the industrial inputs, whatever inputs go into the industrial sector, like the minerals or the non-metallic minerals, they are combined to get an industrial input index. And there we are seeing that still there is positive inflation. It is in the positive territory, but it has started to decline.
To ease.
So as absolutely correct that there are signs of deceleration in input prices. And even if we look at the PMIs, the Purchasing Managers Index sample survey for manufacturing and services, they have also reported that input costs are easing, and therefore firms will be doing better. But they are all early indications, and they will likely show up in the next quarter. If we look at the April to June quarter, they will show up. And again, for some firms, some sectors, we have already seen a input cost decline, but they're still at an elevated stage for at least these early bird companies.
Right. So in general, costs are likely to decline going forward.
Yes.
But interest costs are still likely to be high because the interest rate is still high. The RBI is showing no signs of reducing the rate. It might have done a pause now, but there's no sign of reduction. So interest costs will remain high, right?
Yes, interest costs will remain high. And in fact, when RBI paused the interest rate hike in the April meeting, a lot of industry bodies welcomed their decision, because they said that, this will help in containing the borrowing costs of industries which have started to rise. Because if they continue to rise on a sustained basis, the capacity to repay debt will ultimately start getting impacted. So it needs to be seen how interest expenses shape the overall financial position of firms, and once we add more sectors, for example, currently we do not have in this set many firms in the infra sector.
Okay.
We do not have many firms which may have borrowed a lot, or which may have a lot of exposure to banking loans. When we include all those, maybe interest expenses could rise further. So while the raw material expenses will definitely show a declining trend as seen from WPI, but this interest expenses is something to watch out for as the sample set increases and also in the coming quarters.
Right. And now I know that these are early bird results, and so we are anyway extrapolating from them to look at what happened in the quarter. But can we do a further extrapolation, given that it's the final quarter of that financial year? Can we look at the overall performance over the year and see how they've done?
Yes. So it's always, especially when the March results are out, what we do see is that quarterly results are volatile, especially if you look at the profit numbers. They are highly volatile, and they are driven by some developments that may have happened in that quarter and may not happen in the subsequent quarters and so on. So it's better to look at the 4 quarter sum, the developments around the 4 quarters that constitute the entire financial year. And if we look at that, things are not that bad. In fact, things are given that 2022 was a challenging year by all measures, global headwinds, high inflation, monetary policy tightening, commodity price rises, supply chain bottlenecks. Despite all of that, the sales revenues year-on-year growth is in double digit. There's only a slight dip.
Oh, that's good news.
Yes, that's good news. That's why, it's always better to look at not just the quarter, even for GDP.
Right.
It's better to look at the annual numbers, not just the quarters, because there are a lot of revisions. Same is the case for firm level data also, to look at the annual numbers. And there we see that sales are doing well. And in fact, here in annual numbers, when we look at raw material expenses, the growth has come down.
Oh,
because 2021-22 costs started to rise. From second half of this financial year, costs have started to come down. So overall, if we see as compared to the previous financial year, raw material expenses have declined. The concerning element continues to be interest expenses, because that is the case for the entire financial year. So interest expenses are elevated for the whole financial year as compared to the previous financial year. And even the profitability is not that bad, considering, if you remember, 2019-20 was a pre-COVID year, was very bad for the manufacturing sector. In fact, the GVA growth was flat in that year. So in 2022-23, we have done better than 2019-20, even though there have been so many challenges. So it's better to look at the annual numbers. And when you look at sales, when you're looking at costs, when you're looking at profit, let us just combine them and come up with one summary statistic, which is the gross value addition. Which is what is which is used as a input in the GDP calculation. So gross value addition is nothing but the sum of profit before tax, depreciation, and labor costs, which is wages and salaries given by firm. So here, when we see, again, the GVA numbers are not that bad. They are good. And remember, we are only looking at these 59 firms. When we add more firms, the position can change. But for these firms, the numbers look good. The encouraging thing is that WPI has come down in 2022-23. So when we exclude the inflation impact and we look at GVA in real terms, gross value addition in real terms, it comes to around 5%, which is reasonable for a challenging year like this one. So GVA growth for 59 firms is around 5%, and that is because inflation, WPI inflation for the whole year is around 9.5%. Which is lower than what we saw in 2021-22.
Absolutely.
So bottom line, while quarterly numbers are showing some disturbance because of interest expenses and not so much visible decline in raw material expenses, but when we look at the overall annual picture, we do see comfortable, decent growth given the various challenges.
That's certainly good to hear. And now, as always, we have several insightful questions from our audience members. And so the first is, do you think with an increase in profits and revenue, even if it is subdued, we can now finally see an increase in private sector investment in infrastructure especially? Or would they still be cautious because of the current global scenario that you've already talked about?
Yeah, so it's like, see, the early, if we look at some of the early indications, we look at capacity utilization, we look at demand, we are seeing some initial signs of recovery, but again, global headwinds, uncertainty play a great role in shaping investment decisions. So it is some time before we can see a consistent, stable increase in private investment.
Right. And now this is again to do with the corporates' profitabilities and their ability to invest in particular things. So this question is to do with R&D. What holds back corporates from spending money on R&D and product development? Does the tax system create a disincentive against R&D spending, or is it a matter of profitability and not enough money?
Yes, so R&D is definitely a problem, and in fact, has been a recent study by the Niti Aayog, which says that India's R&D spending is one of the lowest among the world. It's around, in terms expressed as a share of GDP, it's around 0.7%. The global average is more than 1%. So it's definitely a problem. But there are some other problems also that needs to be looked into in addition to the aggregate number.
Okay.
One is that the R&D the distribution of R&D sectorally is skewed. Whatever R&D is happening, it is happening at the government level, and it is happening in most of the R&D is happening in health and defense. Right. So whereas in other sectors, it's the private sector that takes the major initiatives in research and development. Here it is not the case. So therefore, it is for the private sector investors to spend more money on research and development, because that is also needed to retain the human capital. Because if R&D is not satisfactory, if there are not enough innovations happening in the sector, in the company, it won't be possible to retain the talent of human capital, and we will see more of brain drain happening. So it's definitely a cause of concern, particularly for companies, because in India, the private corporate sector R&D is not very encouraging. Right. But the other element is also that the data on R&D needs to be improved. We don't have a very nice system of reporting the R&D spending. So that is also something that needs to be thought through, because there are various studies which say that the R&D expenditure reported in India is underestimated. So all these things need to be taken into account to frame an assessment about R&D. But definitely the private corporate sector needs to do much more on research and development. And I don't think it's so much to do with the tax system. It's just that the prioritization of companies are different. They are not spending too much on R&D. Though in recent months, not years also, recent months, we are seeing some impetus towards R&D by some companies. But it needs to be sustained, and it's not that we don't have the potential. We do have potential, and that is why you see so many foreign players in the automobile sector. We are seeing so many players like the Kia and Hyundai investing in India. So definitely there is potential, but that initiative needs to come from the indigenous corporate sector.
And you mentioned human capital, and our next question is about exactly that, which is, why is it that with the corporates in profits, quarter after quarter, that so many layoffs are happening? Now, I would ask you as a follow-on question to this: is it that they're in profit because the layoffs are happening, or is it that the profits are happening and they're still laying off people?
Absolutely, very insightful question, and I'll answer in two parts. Firstly, it's a very sectoral specific story. It's a sector specific story. Most of the layoffs are happening in the IT field.
Right.
They are happening in ed tech, technology oriented fields. Particularly in technology, we are seeing because they have been impacted by global headwind. So as a cost saving measure, we are seeing layoffs happening.
Right.
For edtech, like say Byju's and other such firms, what we see is that they really misread the optimism that they saw last year or just after COVID. So they did a lot of hiring, they did a lot of expansion, they did a lot of investment, and that they could not sustain, and that resulted in mass layoffs. So it's a lot of these events need to be studied sector-wise. But if we look at the various surveys that have been recently conducted for hiring for 2022 and 2023, what we are seeing is that hiring has increased. It has picked up in non-IT sectors, not in IT sector.
I see.
In IT sector, the layoffs are more than 20%. But in the non-IT sectors, for example, because of now pent-up demand, because of services picking up in hospitality, tourism, financial services, insurance, we are seeing a lot of hiring happening.
Right.
We also did a discussion on, export of services picking up.
Correct.
So there we are seeing a lot of hiring happening. There is a very recent survey by Naukri.com on this aspect, and they have given this sectoral insights that despite more than 20% layoff in the IT sector, the other sectors are seeing the steady rise in the hiring activity. And that we also see in the annual numbers. If you look at the salary and wages of companies of these only 59 firms, the growth has been more than what we saw in 21-22. So definitely it is a sector specific story, and it's not applicable to all sectors.
Now, as a kind of summing up question, we have another one from the audience, which kind of asks, how come that the corporates are actually making profits? Because they say, if we are saying that global demand is reducing, rupee is depreciating against the dollar, lending rates are high, there's fear of global recession, then how are the corporates being able to manage to make profits?
It's a follow-up to what you had also asked earlier. So we see the dynamics have changed from 2020 onwards. So let's step back a little and see what happened to the firm's position. Just after COVID in 2020, April to June quarter, firm's balance sheet position was bad. What we saw from the July-September quarter, the second quarter, what we saw was that firms started doing a lot of cost rationalization. They started laying off, they started cutting costs, and that improved their profits. So profits did not rise due to increase in sales, but profits rose due to cost cutting and cost rationalization. Now this continued for 2 quarters, that is September 2020 and December 2020.
Right.
Now, then COVID started receding, and in 2021, we saw that the increase in profits was also accompanied by increase in sales. So, and therefore the cost rationalization was not the prime driving force of profits, but it was also the sales because of pent-up demand. The sales were picking up. Then comes 2022, where costs started rising again. The war happened, logistic costs started to rise. Again, the balance sheet, the financial position of firms were impacted because of higher expenses. So, and then again, they started doing in the initial quarter some cost cutting to raise their profits. So we are seeing that this profit is a function of cost cutting in some quarters, and is also a function of rise in sales revenue. Now, coming to this question, yes, there have been various global headwinds, but we need to remember that domestic demand has remained resilient in all these quarters, and that is something which has driven the rise in sales revenue. So despite all, we are seeing that sales revenues are still in double-digit growth. So that is for again non-IT sector, particularly services have been doing well because the pent-up demand, it's not just the pent-up demand which got exhausted, but still we are seeing demand indicators remaining strong, and it's the domestic demand which have driven the rise in revenue of firms in the recent quarters.
I see. So, and this is actually something that even the UN and the World Bank have said, that the Indian economy has actually been remarkably resilient in this global atmosphere. So there you have it. Now we looked at data, yes, albeit it's 59 companies that
Yes.
we've looked at.
Yes.
And so you shouldn't look at the absolute reading as being an indication of what's happening, because as more companies release their results, these numbers will change, but the overall trend is indicative. You have revenue and profits that are more subdued right now. And the reason that profits are subdued is because costs have increased, and within costs, it's interest costs that have increased quite rapidly. This is because the interest rate hikes done by the RBI since May 2022 are now starting to have an effect to affect corporate profitability. But on the other side, you're seeing the wholesale price index, it's easing, it's been easing for a few months, and going ahead, we're likely to see some amount of further easing. So those costs might ease. So this is the kind of snapshot we have for the corporate sector, and that's all we have for you for this episode of Macrosutra. But before you go, I have an appeal to make to you, which is to do with subscribing to ThePrint. Now, we at ThePrint are very, very proud of the work that we do. We do in-depth reportage. We go to various places and bring you stories that maybe don't come to you from any other source. We do analysis. We do a lot of graphics work. We do videos. And all of this requires time and effort and quite a bit of money. So I would urge you to please subscribe to ThePrint, because this is what will enable us to continue doing the kind of work that we do. And apart from this, it also gives you several benefits. If you do subscribe, you get priority passes to all of our webinars and on-ground events. You can write in for us as part of our Your Turn section, where you can write your own opinion in the form of an article and it'll be published. And finally, our editors write regular newsletters that go out to all of our subscribers, where we talk about the news of the day and we give our perspective. So it is quite a value addition that subscribers do have access to. So I'd urge you to subscribe. The link is in the description of this video. Please do subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.